Welcome, everybody. Nice to be talking to you again on this second Workflow Wednesday. Today's focus is on the definition workflow, and we'll give a quick anatomy of the pieces of a workflow. Then I'll give 4 examples of definition workflows. I'll summarize what I consider are the advanced features of workflow. We'll talk a bit about versioning your workflow. And then the last piece will be how to think about migrating. If you're using a workflow now and you want to change that, what do you need to think about with your definitions as you migrate to that new workflow? I will leave about 15-20 minutes at the end for Q&A. If you want to pop something into the question or chat box, you can do that at any time. I may answer it during the session, but I may just wait until the end as well. I think at the end, I'm going to try to field, if you have specific questions about a workflow you're trying to think through, don't hesitate to kind of get to the weeds a little bit if you need to. If it gets just a little too much, I may divert it and say, let's take a call after, in the next week or so to cover it. But this program, today's webinar is going to be a little detailed and assumes a reasonable familiarity with the workflow features. Okay, so quick anatomy review. So workflows consist of stages, and the stages are sequential. And you can picture a brick wall between stage 1 and the next stage. So if you have a sequential tasks, task A needs to happen before step B, which needs to happen, task A needs to happen before task B, before task C, then each of those would be their own stage. Steps are activities that can occur within a stage, and you can have multiple steps within a stage, and these steps would occur simultaneously within that stage. So in this example of the one on the right, there are 2 steps in that stage, and they both, B could occur first, A could occur first. They happen simultaneously. The way that you move across stages is through transition actions. That is how a definition would move from the stages, across the stages. The people would be the ones who would be selecting the transition actions. And there are 3 ways to add people: a simple user group, something called an assignment mapping, and something called a named role. A conditional is also part of the anatomy, and that is on definition workflow, you can conditional on the functional area, a data system, or a data classification code if you are using the data classification codes. So in the conditional situation, one of your attributes in one of those 3 categories, let's take functional area, we'll see an example with HR. So definitions in the human resources functional area will be routed to a different workflow than all of your other definitions in all other functional areas. So it's a way conditionals allow you to use 2 workflows at once, 2 different workflows at once for your definitions. Okay, I want to quickly, before I show you some examples, let's go over to the cookbook. Here I'm in a demo account here, and I'm on the home page for starting a definition. So this is a definition called part-time employee. This is the created definition page. And I want to illustrate so the workflow that's going to operate now is called the primary definition workflow. And when I change my functional area, if I choose admissions functional area, I'm good. If I choose human resources, I will use a different workflow. So I wanted just to show you visually where that when you have conditionals, where that difference in workflow would become visible to you. The other thing I want to visually point out to you is in a definition, I want to point out the workflow panel. Just navigate here to a specific definition. We'll go to academic advising. The panel defaults to being closed, and any user can show that workflow panel. We call this the workflow panel, and that exposes each stage. Each of these buttons is a stage, and then the steps are itemized in the row above. Transition actions are listed over here on the right. The dark blue one is always your happy path. next step, and any other alternative actions are available through the other actions drop-down box. So you want to be mindful of the language that you use in your labeling of stages and in your labeling of steps, so that when the user who is working within the workflow, the editors or the data stewards, they can quickly understand where they are in the workflow and what their next step is and how they should move, what their options are to move it forward. So keep in mind this view of the workflow when you are customizing your workflow. All right, so let's go back to let's talk about some examples. I'm going to show you 4. One I'll just call the primary workflow. It is by far the main workflow that I see clients customize towards. Then we're going to look at the primary workflow combined with human resources. We're going to look at a workflow that allows voting. This is very popular in a data governance group situation. And then kind of the 4th one is just, I have seen this, I did see a client do this. They had some team editing occur prior to the data steward doing an approval. So let's look at these one by one here. Let's look at primary workflow. As I said, this is by far what I see as the most popular way clients will customize the default workflow. Definition comes in under drafting. The data steward reviews it. The definition is routed to the appropriate data steward based on the functional area that uses an assignment mapping. A technical review then occurs. So this is based on the data system. Technical editors with skills in that data system will provide a technical definition, and then a standards review will occur at the end. Standards not intended to undermine the knowledge of the data steward, but intended to look for editorial standards control, making sure that the content reads well, follows standards. So that standards, again, it's not to undermine the data steward, nor is it serving a governance role. It's an editorial control that many clients are appreciative of having. Let me check my notes here. So let's take a look at this in the cookbook specifically. So we're going to go over to our workflow area here. And I've defaulted now. Here's my panel of all my workflows available. I'm in the definition type. You can see in this demo account, I have like 7 of them because I built out the examples that we're going to use today. But let's focus on this one, the primary definition approval. And let's look at what I consider to be kind of the tricky parts to that. So we talked about there is a assignment mapping here in the data steward review, and that's characterized over here on the assignment area. Here's data stewards by functional area, so that's what's going to give me the automatic routing that we spoke about. Another key thing is that the data steward has the ability to, actually it's at the drafting stage, the data steward has the ability to approve if they are the person who starts the definition. So this is I'm in the drafting stage at this point. I backed up in the workflow, sorry about that. I'm in the drafting stage, and there are 2 steps. And this is the one for the data steward to be able to start it, and they have the approve capability. Notice the general editor, the version creator, does not have that. And approve is tagged as an entry point. Submit is also tagged as an entry point. And that will allow those transition actions, approve and submit, to appear on that initial created definition form. I'm just going to quickly track over there so that you can see where those buttons, where that entry point. So if I'm a data steward and I want to enter this and approve it immediately, I can do that. It's just a time saver, it's a convenience. So entry point, this is where that button will appear if you select a transition action as an entry point. It appears at the worksheet, I call it the worksheet, where a definition is first created. We're going to travel back here a bit, back to that workflow. Okay, let's look back here and look at some of the other trickier, interesting parts to this workflow. Okay. Let's look at some alternate paths. So in the situation where there is no technical definition needed at the first creation of the definition, the data steward can opt, they have an alternate path, they can skip the technical review and simply select to submit it to the standards review. The happy path takes it to technical review, but the data steward is free to skip that and move straight to standards. This gray alternate path is the one that illustrates that approve upon creation, that entry point that the data steward also has available. So those are some of the last thing I wanted to show. So there's two assignment mappings in this one. The first one is the data steward one. That's pretty common. It routes it by functional area. This one is routing it by data system. So prior to that stage being hit, so in either the drafting stage or the data steward review stage, somebody had to have identified a data system. And if that was identified, then it will route by that data system to a certain user group of technical editors. I just want to show that in this assignment mapping, you can use just a general category of user group. So I do have editors specific to my ERP system and to my LMS system, but for the others, I don't really have specialized technical editors. So I'm going to keep reusing this general user group category. You do need to complete the mappings for each one. If there was no mapping here and someone did select this data system, your workflow would stop. The object would not physically be able to progress. So just to create placeholders there, I do recommend filling it with a general user group of general experts. All right, let's go back to that workflow. And that is all I wanted to say about the primary definition workflow. Let's go back now and look at, so you'll get this PowerPoint slide, and the tricky things that I just mentioned will be listed there on the next slide after the picture. Here's the situation where the two workflows are being used. So the primary one, we just looked at that, is in use. And then there is a human resources one that's using a conditional. So it's different. It's the same through the orange dot. And then in human resources, folks felt that they wanted a security review, looking specifically for private data violations, privacy violations, or identifiable information situations. Just wanted a little bit more oversight on those definitions. And then it goes to a technical review, and they opted to not have a standards review for the HR one. They felt that when going through this added level would give it the standards, they felt that they had it covered, so they did away with it, and it just goes straight to approval. So a little bit different there in the HR version. In the cookbook itself, what that looks like is the HR one must be, note both are active, but the HR one must be positioned on top of the primary definition approval workflow. So when the definition is created and if human resources is selected as the functional area, it will traverse this workflow. If not human resources, the definition will continue to move through this list until it hits a workflow that it qualifies for. And in this case, everything else will hit this one, primary definition approval. So when you have conditionals, you need to make sure that you have the proper order of the definition workflows on your workflow worksheet page. Let's look at now some of the things that make that human resources workflow tricky. Of course, here's the conditional. Functional area is human resources. And that's set at this workflow at the home page. I call this the home page of the workflow itself. The rest of it is identical to the other one, with the exception, of course, of no standards review. But the technical review operates the same. It uses the same assignment mapping. All the rest of it remains the same. And it accommodates, because it accommodates a situation where, data storage review, yes. If there are two functional areas, let's say it was in finance and human resources. So because of the human resources, it's going to flag through this workflow. But because I've used my data stewards by functional area assignment mapping, the HR data steward will be notified, and so will the finance steward. So both can still participate as it moves through the HR workflow. It'll just have those extra steps at the end of it. Okay, let me make sure I've gone through. Yeah, those are all the only points I wanted to make about conditionals. All right, let's look at the next workflow, which is about voting. And this is in my list here. So it's a pretty simple one. Starts out the same as 95% of our workflows for definitions do. Starts out in drafting by an editor, routed automatically to the data steward using an assignment mapping. Then it goes to a governance vote, and then it goes to approval. The steward operates the same, I already said that. What happens in the governance, let's look and see what makes that governance stage tricky. The assignment is just to a simple user group, and there are 3 people in it, George, Lisa, and Peter. So there's 3 people, that's the governance group. All 3 of them are required to act. So there's an all here. Remember the any all tag? If I open up my step, remember I have the any all choice. I chose all. So all 3 of them must take some kind of action. And the definition will wait in that stage until all 3 of them have acted. The other piece then the safety valve that the administrator put on to that, notice there's no timeout. I opted to not use a timeout, so it's going to sit there until all 3 of them act. But there's a catch. Let me cancel, just update this. The catch is that there's an override. So this will allow any user with an administrator permission to enter the definitions at this stage and move that definition to the approve status. And approve only because it's the next stage. Override allows an administrator to move the definition from the current stage it's in to the next stage, which happens to be for us the approved state. So it's a way that an administrator can nudge something forward should it get stuck there. So that's a nice pattern there. So it uses the all, it does not use timeout, it does use override for administrators in order to nudge things along. But the assignment itself is pretty straightforward. It's a simple user group with all of your governance members in it. Okay. Let's look at the next workflow. Oh, sorry, one last thing I wanted to show you on voting. The governance people are not allowed to edit. They do not have edit permissions. So to kind of demonstrate that, show that step again. That's what makes it a vote. See, allowable actions, they don't have edit or collaborate checked. I'll open up that step so you can see, remember to click the edit or collaborate. Very common to click edit for that activity. Not done here. That's what makes it a vote. You can't touch it. You can't change it. You can't touch it. You can either say yes and approve it, or you can say send it back to the data steward and discuss what changes you would want to see to it. So I think that's an important, preventing editing I think is important if what your goal is to get a concrete yes or no vote. Okay. Now let's go on and look at a workflow that uses a functional team editing. So this workflow utilizes the expertise of people within a business area who are not the steward, but who can help shape that definition prior to its getting to the steward. It lowers the burden of work on the steward's shoulders. Definition comes in by an editor. It might be quite in quite a well, just in draft form. Some folks in the business unit that, you know, the bursar's office, the registrar's office, the financial aid office, take a crack at it and shape it and improve it, so that then when it goes to the data steward, it's been, some of their work's been done already. So it's just simply a time saver. Could be a way to, if you want to groom some people to become data stewards, it can be a way to kind of test that out. Let's look at some of the tricky parts of this. There's a couple of interesting things here. So it's required, so it's routed by editors by functional areas. So it's using an assignment mapping. It required, make sure that the definition will wait for all appropriate people to be notified based on your functional area. All are required to act. So if you've got 2 or even 3 people in some of these user groups in your assignment mapping, it's going to wait for everybody to act. That's a long wait. So that's a heavy wait there. There's a 3-day timeout to balance that. Because the spirit of this is, okay, everybody equally involved in this step. Everybody equally has got 3 days to take a look. It's not going to go anywhere unless everyone acts, but it's really going to wait for you until you can have time to look at it. If 3 days go by and you haven't touched it, it moves on to the data steward. The timeout means that the item will move forward along the happy path to the next stage. So it's kind of a balance between it's really not going to go anywhere because all have to act and in all functional areas, but then after 3 days it will move forward. And if all the people are busy, you know, it just moves forward. It's not a problem, but it does wait. Okay, other points I wanted to make on this. That was all I wanted to make on that. I haven't seen this very often. Once or twice I've seen this stage created. Okay, so let's go back to the slide deck and kind of, that's the end of the samples part. Let's kind of talk about the advanced features that we saw illustrated in each of those. So several types of alternate paths. The ability to send back, the ability to leapfrog over, the ability to override. We saw use of the entry point, which allows you to jump to a later stage from the created definition starting point. We saw multiple steps per stage. In the primary workflow, we saw 2 steps in the first drafting stage, one for the typical drafter and one for moderators or data stewards to use. And we saw the use of a conditional. And you can, again, to remind you, conditioned by functional area, data system, or classification code. So things to think about when you migrate to a new workflow. So your definitions stay within the workflow that was in use when that definition was created. So if you've got 23 definitions in your current workflow and tomorrow you want to activate a new workflow, those definitions will stay in that first workflow. And that first workflow will continue to be active and available for them. Once you install the new workflow, that first workflow is closed, but it still remains functional, and those objects, those definitions can continue on the normal path. That's not a problem. Sometimes clients want to use the second workflow as the only workflow, and they want those earlier definitions to be stamped, if you will, by that second new workflow. So there's two ways you could do that. One is to make sure all of your definitions were approved prior to installing the second workflow. So everything, take all, whatever I said, 23 definitions, take all 23 definitions to the approved state, install the second workflow, and then manually reopen all definitions into the second version, and they will all then utilize the new second workflow. That's one option. The other option is to export all of your definitions, then delete them out of the cookbook, install your new workflow, and re-import all your definitions. Upon the re-import, those definitions will all hit the initial stage, the drafting stage of that new workflow. So there's pros and cons to those methods. That second one with the export and import is, I see that most often with clients very new. They've got maybe 20 definitions and 2 specifications, because what is broke gets broken. What you have to disable is you have to deattach any definitions that are attached to a specification. You have to deattach them before you're going to be allowed to delete them. So that's work. You have to manually deattach. Then when you re-import them, you have to manually reattach them. So it's quite a bit of manual work with those definitions that are associated with any specifications. The first example, where you just push all of your existing definitions, whatever state they're in, whatever stage they're in, you just push them all to approve so that you can reversion them in the new workflow. Some clients find that confusing because it then kind of falsely approved definitions. I find with clients with very active data governance councils, and maybe there's quite a few people on that council, it would just create too much confusion. They would say, I didn't approve that. How did that get by? Why did that get approved? And that creates its own bucket of issues, if you will. So they will prefer to have their, in that case, the clients usually prefer to have the definitions close out of the workflow they were in. And then when any new things are created or pre-existing definitions are versioned, they use then the second new workflow. The tricky part there is now you have 2 workflows in use, and if that could go on for a couple of weeks, but you don't really want that to go on for a couple of months. So like I said, there's pros and cons, I think, to how you approach that migration. You want to choose the ones that you can anticipate are going to be the least confusing to your environment. Versions. You can version a workflow. That's one way. So when you do need to migrate, you might be migrating because you created a brand new workflow. But you might also be migrating just because you have created a new version of it. So when you edit a workflow, after it's been activated, when you edit a workflow, these tasks on top are the ones that will trigger a new version. And they are, I describe these as substantially changing the structure of the workflow. Add a stage, add a step, change the any all feature within a step, change an entry point or override within a transition action, or create a conditional. Any of those activities, you will be prompted, this action will trigger a new version of the workflow. Do you wish to continue? So you'll get a prompt before that. These other modifications you can make to a workflow will not prompt a new version. You can make them at any time to no impact. Changes to labeling or descriptive information. Change the name of your stage. Change the name of a step. Change the descriptive information within a step. Change the name of the workflow. All of those kinds of changes do not trigger a version. You can check or uncheck the required feature on a step. You can create new transition actions or edit existing transition actions. I was surprised that you could edit new transition actions or create new transition actions. I would have anticipated that as forcing a new version, but it does not. The last thing that's really helpful that you can swap out without disturbing your versioning is the assignment. Whether it's a user group, an assignment mapping, or a name drill, you can swap any of those out and it will not trigger. And of course, you can also change the group assignments within any of those features and not trigger a change in workflow. So you can swap out the people very easily within a workflow.